June 14th, 2014. I can say the date now without the taste of bile. I can set it like a peg in a timeline, June 14th, 2014, and step back to see how that afternoon rippled outward through years, calendars, and the private economies of attention in which my family and I practiced our small betrayals. That day should have been a center in our house. Instead, the house rearranged itself around someone else's joy. For 7 years I carried the shape of that displacement like a stone under my ribs. Unremarkable in size, dense as ballast, until the edges of it smoothed into the curve of breathing and the ordinary rhythms of life. The work of unpacking that day began a few months later. In the autumn of 2014, I sat across from Dr. Morales in a clinic office that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. A potted plant leaned toward the window light. A small certificate framed her credentials. She listened in a way that felt almost rude at first, refusing the American habit of filling silence with quick comfort. "Name the date," she said, and so I did, June 14th, 2014. She asked me to place that date on a shelf of memory and to catalogue what had happened. The party invitation that arrived in a flurry of digital notifications, the time of the ceremony, the photo on the family blog cropped to remove me, the sensation of air leaving the room as if someone had taken a breath out of the house. Dr. Morales taught me to trace patterns. "Remorse often sounds like performance," she said once, and the sentence planted itself in my head like a seed. Her approach was methodical and unromantic. Name the date, list the people present, describe exactly what occurred, and then map the reactions. It was archival work, procedural and steady, and in its steadiness it felt like salvation. To give shape to the hurt was to deny it the freedom to metastasize into a generalized grievance. The context in which our family struggled was not only private. The mid-2010s were a peculiar cultural moment. Social media had moved from novelty into a domestic record-keeping. My mother kept a family blog that functioned partly as scrapbook, partly as small theater. A place for recipes, vacation photos, and the confessions households perform for themselves. In the era before ephemeral stories dominated feeds, that blog was an archive. A post could be dug up months later and read aloud at holidays. A cropped photograph became a permanent artifact. The public and the private overlapped in ways that made omissions and small erasures feel both shameful and irreversible. Dr. Morales helped me see my personal hurt within that larger social transformation. The compulsion, in that decade, to perform joy outwardly could, within a family setting, make room for erasure. Family therapy began like any attempt to alter a long-honed choreography, clumsy, misstepped, earnest in the worst ways. We gathered around a rectangular table in a therapy room with a window that looked onto maple trees. There were silences that felt like solid objects and forced laughs that sounded brittle. My parents tended to fill pauses with explanations that doubled as defenses, rehearsed apologies shaped to be palatable to others. My sister surprised me by arriving quieter than expected. Where she had once leaned forward to take center stage for our parents' benefit, she now sat with her hands folded and a voice that thinned at times. In pieces across sessions she told a story I recognized, a childhood where attention felt like finite currency and the way to survive was to bid loudest. She said, plainly and in tears more than once, that she had not meant to make me vanish. That admission reframed the moral geometry. It was not grand villainy but an inherited mechanism in which certain behaviors were rewarded and therefore repeated. We worked through years in months. The therapy schedule itself became a chronology, weekly sessions, then bi-weekly, then check-ins. There were technical exercises, role-playing where I practiced saying I was hurt, without turning it into a prosecution, communication protocols where each of us had 3 uninterrupted minutes to speak, assignments to write down memories and bring them to the next appointment. Dr. Morales's language was precise and humane. "Speak what you remember," she would say. "Say what you felt. Allow the other person to hold that without insisting on changing it." The goal was not theatrical apologies but a grammar for living together again. Repair began with small, material acts that functioned like stitches. My mother, who habitually couch-ed everything in domestic labor, began to practice that labor with different intent. Foil-wrapped eggs slid into my hands at dawn, offered without announcement. My father, who fled emotional exposure by becoming industrious, started to perform presence in awkward domestic ways. Driving me to the supermarket and waiting in the car until I re-emerged radio low, lifting grocery bags into the trunk with exaggerated care as if the visible smallest errand might atone for larger failures. My sister returned an old object she had once kept, a diner photograph she had cropped to exclude me, and on the back of the restored print she taped an apology in handwriting that still tilted in childish loops. None of these gestures healed the wound on their own. No single act would. They were attempts to desensitize us to reflexes, to teach the muscles of belonging how to move differently. We learned to notice the small tests of change, the days someone remembered my birthday without prompting, the calls that arrived when I asked, invitations checked against a shared calendar rather than tossed like confetti. We built rituals not because we loved ritual for its own sake but because, in the arithmetic of family life, the mundane often protects against spectacular injury. The repairs were not monotonic. We slid back into old patterns. My parents would sometimes compare me to my sister in the casual way people compare weather, an offhand remark in which my value was measured by another's shape. Birthdays were occasionally forgotten or celebrated in a rhetorical generosity that excluded the person whose day it was. I learned to name the pain directly. "That hurts," I would say. "Please don't do that." Those small sentences were not oracles, they were boundary maintenance. Repeated, they turned into habits. Apologies that once arrived as flat puffs of air gradually acquired weight and shape. Outside the house, the wider world pressed in. The years from 2014 to 2020 were not merely domestic training, they were years of political convulsion and technological change. The shock waves of the 2016 election reframed how families argued in living rooms. Smartphone photography and instant sharing meant an action could become public in an hour. Conversations about mental health moved from whispers into mainstream etiquette. We brought these new vocabularies back to therapy, boundaries, emotional labor, microaggressions, trying them on like clothes that had not been tailored for our bodies. The family's economy of attention reflected, in miniature, broader cultural norms about visibility and publicity. By 2019, there were patterns that felt more durable. My mother's blog shifted toward a steadier honesty. After many sessions and much prompting, she agreed to write a post that acknowledged plainly what had happened on June 14, 2014. We recorded her reading it at my kitchen table, my phone balanced on a stack of recipes, afternoon light slanting through the blinds, her hands slightly shaky as she smoothed the paper. She stumbled over phrases where the old instinct to soften the blow tugged at her. Then she read a single line as if each syllable were buckling under its own truth. "We failed you on June 14, 2014. When she said it aloud, the sentence landed like weather. It did not make the wound vanish, but it shifted the household's gravity. The admission occupied public space on the family blog. It became something we could point to without collapsing under shame. It was less a theatrical confession and more a documented fact. In March 2020, the world rearranged itself. The pandemic entered the national lexicon with the abruptness of a manufactured code: lockdowns, masks, case counts, and the language of flattened curves. Families like mine were pressure-tested. Years of incremental work compressed into domestic logistics. My parents fell ill in the first wave, fevers, coughs that made them quieter and more fragile than I had ever seen. Responsibilities that had been diffuse returned to the household nucleus: telehealth appointments, medication schedules, and the awkward choreography of isolation and caregiving. Those months made visible the long-standing economies of attention that had defined our family. My sister's pattern of easing tension by speaking for other people resurfaced in new contexts. In mixed company online, in Zoom calls with cousins and friends, she sometimes softened my account without asking, describing my feelings in ways that made them more palatable to others. When I called her on it, she admitted, sometimes with surprising frankness, that she feared public rupture more than private injury. Her fear of consequence outpaced the scale of harm she had caused me. She told me she had smoothed the story to protect the family's image during crises. I replied that I did not want protection from pain, I wanted presence and accountability. That distinction mattered at a time when public and private were entangled by technology. When a photograph can cross the country in seconds, domestic erasure acquires new modalities. The months that followed blurred into the odd rhythms of pandemic life. There were days when I was grateful to be the person who could make systems for their care and days when the ledger felt unbearably heavy. Nights when the thought of being the sole repository of their shame felt like an unreasonable role. I insisted on shared responsibility. I asked my parents to invite old friends back into their lives and to let therapists hold the work of contrition. Practical help did not equal absolution. It could be given without surrendering moral currency. We planted a small tree in the backyard the following June. The sky was low and clear, our shovels made a neat hole, the earth smelled of a spring that had not been dramatic. My mother read the line she had written. "We failed you on June 14, 2014. We are sorry." This time in the backyard, less for an audience than to give air to a truth. We did not dramatize the moment. There was no improvised speech to sweep the wound away. We planted the tree as if to mark a named mistake that could become a living reminder, to be tended into something that might one day shade a future meal. Caregiving became an intensified responsibility in the months after the first wave. My father's cough did not subside, and one long night, autumn not yet, but an early spring in the first year of global lockdown, I realized how thin the border between restitution and responsibility really was. He asked me, voice weak with cough, to bring soup and to stay. He wanted someone with him, and the request reopened the ledger in my chest. I did not become a caregiver by instinct. I negotiated the terms of my presence the way one negotiates debt and duty. I agreed to be present for measurable needs, organizing remote appointments when clinics were overwhelmed, keeping careful lists of medications and times, arranging grocery deliveries when leaving the house felt like a moral failing. I sat through nights when fever shortened breaths and brought him chicken soup that tasted like the thin medicinal comfort of quarantine. I insisted that my parents continue therapy. I asked them to sustain social connections that were not solely dependent on me. I wanted their shame not to settle on a single set of shoulders. Time made other dynamics clear. My sister's habit of smoothing the story reappeared in virtual family gatherings. She would sometimes translate my anger into gentler language because she feared a public rupture more than private pain. I told her again and again, I did not want stories softened on my behalf. I wanted presence, accountability, and permission to be seen as I was, jagged edges and all. In a world where a single photo could carry erasure across platforms, that insistence mattered. Caregiving in the months that followed was both ordinary and jagged. There were mornings when his hand felt cold and thin in mine, and I could not reconcile that touch with the man who once drove me to the supermarket and waited in the car. There were bursts of lucidity, laughter that returned, contrite and ridiculous, when he told a story about a terrible 6-year-old haircut, and we laughed with the sort of connection that feels more like repair than apology. There were afternoons of muted grief, my mother unpicking apologies into thin, repeating sentences, me coordinating with hospice, making lists for a hospital bag, arranging a neighbor to mow the lawn when appointments crowded our days. One autumn evening in 2021, exactly 7 years after June 14, 2014, my mother came to me on the couch with a desperation stripped of public posture. Her fingers gripped a mug as if it were an anchor. My father's cough had returned with a new ferocity. Doctor's language shifted from technical to urgent, sustained decline, limited prognosis. "We need you," she said. "We need you to be with him. We can bear the thought of this without you." That night was not theatrical penance. There was no family blog post, no prepackaged speech. There was a rawness to her plea that disarmed me and reopened old calculus, old grievances pressed up against new needs. I did not collapse into automatic forgiveness. Forgiveness in my life had become a conservative thing, a resource to spend deliberately. I saw how my presence could be converted into an emotive covering that allowed them to avoid hard, ongoing work. So I negotiated. I told them plainly what I would do: be present at night when pain made speech lucid and fragile, manage appointments and medications, map their care so it did not depend solely on me. I also told them what I would not do. I would not be their only barometer of shame, nor would I accept that caregiving equaled absolution. I insisted on continued therapy and asked that my sister stop translating our story in ways that smoothed me for appearances. These conditions were not punitive. They were the only honest currency I could trade for intimacy. The last months of my father's life were full of small, ordinary tasks and sudden, jagged grief. We coordinated hospice, dispersed keepsakes, and made lists of practical things to do. When he died, it was quiet and untheatrical. He left, as many people do, in small contracted breaths beneath sheets and monitors that had become the props for ordinary farewell. My mother read a passage she had written at home. My sister, steadier than I expected, placed the edited photograph back in its frame where I could see it. Closure arrived in a liminal flurry of domestic pragmatism, distributing keepsakes, arranging funerary details, and adjusting to the house's new silences. The months that followed converted grief into the mechanics of a life rearranged. My mother calling in the early evening because she was lonely, my sister asking awkwardly about recipes for two, mornings that felt too quiet, the law of absence enacted in small, domestic gestures. The late stretch of those years taught a layered truth: love and harm are not mutually exclusive. People can love and still cause injury. Change is possible, but slow and contingent on habit. Mercy is less an event than a practice. When my parents continued to ask me, for presents, for company, for the practical work of living, I answered with calibrated generosity and hard boundaries. I did not revert to the child who would take guilt and make it a permanent housekeeping task. I offered care where it was needed, and guarded my emotional bandwidth where their needs looked like demands for absolution. Relapses occurred. Habits are stubborn. My parents would sometimes slip back into casual comparisons that measured me against my sister. Gatherings occasionally tokenized my presence. Each time I named the hurt, "Please don't do that." The requests were short and clear. We all wanted to avoid the wars of the early years, so even when surprised or embarrassed, someone would stop and we would correct course. Doctor Morales's phrase about naming the steps had become a kind of domestic liturgy: speak plainly, insist on therapy, protect your bandwidth, repeat as necessary. We also instituted practices that, in their ordinariness, did the heavy lifting of structural reform. We adopted a shared digital calendar where births, graduations, and other important dates were visible to everyone. When my mother planned a celebration, she checked the calendar rather than assuming the house was an empty field. She emailed the family with a single line that had the effect of a law: if this conflicts with something important to you, tell us. It was clumsy and awkward, and protective. We made new household rituals: check before sending invitations, an agreed protocol for celebrating multiple birthdays on one weekend, and a rule that photographs not be reposted or cropped without consent. Therapy remained a shared commitment rather than a punitive sanction. We returned to sessions when old habits resurfaced. Sometimes therapy felt like business, reflecting on who spoke when and cataloging patterns of defensiveness. Other times it felt like celebration, recognizing a small habit reformed, someone asking before a joke, a sister who now called before she spoke for me. Therapy turned interpersonal ethics into accountability mechanisms. We learned to ask structural, not only moral, questions. Why had my sister's announcements been allowed to sideline me? Why had my parents let smoothing take precedence over attention to specific lives? Those questions demanded process as much as language. In the first years after my father's death, my mother's attempts at restitution became steadier and less theatrical. Small notes in the mailbox, "Thinking of you today," lost their performative edge and accrued meaning. Repetition of small actions accreted into a new shape of relationship. My sister, too, changed in both dramatic and quiet ways. She still sought center sometimes, but she learned the discipline of asking permission before making family announcements and stopped editing photographs without consulting me. When she spoke for me, she often called first. When she erred, the apology sounded like reparation rather than reflex. I learned to cultivate a practice of measurement. I stopped asking whether someone said "I'm sorry," and started asking whether they had reorganized their habits in ways that made my place at the table less precarious. I asked for small, repeatable signs, remembering dates, showing up when asked, not smoothing over boundaries as if they were inconvenient obstacles. My demand was not dramatic. It was the humble requirement of being a person who does not want to be erased. Words, I had learned, are cheap. Ordinary decency accumulates into trust. Friends who were morally impatient sometimes asked how I could let my parents back into my life without exacting more punitive, permanent sanctions. They framed the problem as if it were legal. How could I accept them with their past behavior still present? My answer was practical. I weighed family's value against emotional cost and set guardrails. I required acknowledgement and ongoing change. I refused to let apologies buy me back in a single performance. I wanted the monotony of decency, showing up in small, boring ways that made me feel accounted for. The ledger I kept was meant as a tool of wisdom, not a weapon. 7 years after June 14, 2014, with a small tree in the yard and a set of protocols governing how we negotiated attention, the family looked different. It was not a triumphal arc so much as a practical reengineering of habits. Shared calendars, therapy, and explicit rules about how to publicize family events functioned as prosthetics for goodwill. They did not eliminate hurt but reduced how often it was inflicted. There were tests and relapses, old patterns bit like bruises. And yet, when they occurred, we had tools to name them. That hurts, I would say, and someone would stop, surprised or flushed, and the group would correct course. Repeated attention to small things altered the house's grammar. Apologies began, over time, to be accompanied by habit. My mother would call, my sister would ask permission before posting. The work was slow and unglamorous, the mundane labor of sweeping a dusty corner until the dust finally took the hint. When I look back now, what strikes me is how forgiveness shifted from a one-time event into an ongoing liturgy. Forgiveness ceased to be a favor I granted and became a choice I made for my life. I wanted a daily arithmetic that allowed me to stop being a perpetual antagonist. That required restraint and refusal to score points. Often it meant not returning to old slights as conversational default. My choice to restrain myself was not magnanimity so much as strategy, a way of keeping my life moving forward. The economy of emotional labor in families is strange and often cruel. There is a temptation to let one person be the sole ledger through which debts are recorded and paid. I refused that role. I provided practical help, meals, coordination, presence at appointments, because it was the adult, reciprocal thing to do. But I would not accept being the single vessel for their moral feeling. They owed me evidence, I owed them care, not as absolution, but as the hard kindness we give people we have known for decades. Time became the instrument by which this work was evaluated. The 7 years after June 14, 2014 were not passive waiting but a period of watching. Would apologies translate into habit? People apologize spectacularly and then revert to old behaviors. I asked whether my family would change in small, boring ways that protected someone's place at a table. Over months and then years I watched for markers, remembering anniversaries, showing up for simple requests, not smoothing my boundaries. And when those markers arrived I matched them with measured forgiveness. A practical loosening of reserve that preserved memory without ceding the right to perpetual grievance. When my father died, it reframed everything without erasing the fact that I had been sidelined on an important day. The ache remained, a memory with a precise date. But it no longer structured my days. My mother still slid foil-wrapped eggs into my hands on some mornings. My sister still tended toward center, but now with a habit of asking permission. The tree in the backyard stands as both marker and warning, a living thing that needs tending and is vulnerable to frost and wind. It reminds me that mistakes, when named and tended, can be coaxed into something else. If asked now what I would do if faced with that choice again, my answer would be practical rather than theatrical. I would require acknowledgement. I would insist on ordinary, ongoing change and make therapy a condition. I would distribute responsibility and refuse to be the sole repository of shame. I would allow caregiving where it was practical and sustainable. I would forgive, but only as a choice that freed my life rather than normalized other people's avoidance. Those conditions are not punitive. They are the terms by which I learned to live without being defined exclusively by a single wrong. This is not a tidy moral parable. It is a record of how what breaks families can become the raw material for a different life together. One structured by lists, calendars, therapy sessions, quiet apologies, and communal commitments to small decencies. It is a story about how cultural shifts, the family blog era, the ubiquity of smartphone images, the trauma and isolation of a global pandemic, press on private wounds and sometimes force old patterns to change. It is also about agency, how a person can choose the scale and terms of forgiveness and how small, ordinary acts, shared calendars, remembered dates, foil-wrapped eggs, accrue into trust. The ledger remains. I have not emptied it. Memory is a map I consult to navigate new choices. But the ledger need not be armor. I let it inform me without making me immobile. The practical lesson was this: Being seen depends not only on other people's willingness to name the past but on my capacity to guard my boundaries and let new habits accumulate into trust. In the end, I decided against cruelty and against thoughtless magnanimity. I chose instead to be deliberate. Standing now under the small tree that grew where we once made a small, awkward admission, I do not see a monument to failure so much as an emblem of labor performed. The tree is fragile, subject to frost and wind, yet it is alive. It grows in the same soil where we placed a named mistake. The family arrangement we have built is vulnerable in parts and steady in others. It will need tending. Old patterns will reassert themselves, as patterns do. But we have practices that allow us to name harm, insist on repair, and refuse the idea that apology is an all-purpose absolution. If you wanted a moral in a single sentence, here it is: forgiveness, when chosen by the wounded rather than demanded by the one who did the wounding, can be a way to live lightly again, but it is not a gift to be surrendered on rhetoric alone. It is a practice earned through repeated, ordinary acts of decency. That is the architecture of the life I built after June 14, 2014. Clear terms, mundane acts of care, and the slow accumulation of trust. It is not romantic. It is practical. It made room for grief and for change, allowing me to keep the date in my memory and yet live beyond the parking lot of that one day. By June 14, 2021, 7 years from the day that had marked the old hurt, the protocols we had designed were not only rules in a file, they were habits. The family calendar on our phones pinged with the same small insistence that an alarm on a stove has: birthdays, anniversaries, my mother's check-in calls on the second Tuesday of each month, the sisters' scheduled windows for announcing things on the family blog only after asking permission of anyone who would be named or pictured. The tree in the yard had put on a new ring of growth. It was not a monument, it was a living measure of time. The ledger, likewise, had changed. It no longer glowed with a single scandalous entry but with a timeline of renewals and lapses. Forgiveness, as I had insisted, was not granted once and final. It was parceled in installments that matched the rhythm of small, repeatable actions. The world beyond our yard, however, had shifted in ways that made those small, repeatable actions harder and more necessary. The pandemic of 2020 had not only emptied rooms and rerouted careers, it rearranged the geography of care. For much of 2020 and 2021, my parents' social life contracted to a few phone calls and appointments for groceries. My father's absence had always been a silent fact in the house. Now the silence multiplied, and the house itself felt like a set of rooms making new claims on attention. At the same time, the pandemic exposed the brittle wires of family obligations. When everything outside the door tightened, everything inside needed to be stronger to carry the weight. It was in the autumn of 2022, 2 years after the family had learned to be a little less theatrical and a little more procedural, that the ledger was tested in a new register. My mother's health, long fragile and intermittently troublesome, began to decline in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar's sugars and more to do with time's steady attrition. A fall in October left her shaken. A diagnosis of congestive issues in November required more frequent doctor visits. The small notes that had once felt like stage directions, "Thinking of you today," tucked into the mailbox, became urgent reminders of dependence. She called me on a Wednesday and, with a voice that had shed its earlier performative gloss, she asked for help. She did not ask at first for forgiveness, she asked for practical things. An appointment to be driven. Someone to pick up medication. Plans for meals when she could not manage the stove. But in the cadence of those requests there was an undertone that I recognized from the past, the fear that she had run out of chances to fix things before it was too late. On a gray December afternoon, with rain against the windows and the calendar open to a week full of small boxes, she said, "I don't want to be alone. Can you come by more? Can you stay with me for a night or two?" The sentence ended in a different register than the old performance. It was less spectacle than entreaty. I had my ledger to consult. I had the pragmatic demands I had insisted on years before. Acknowledgement, therapy, explicit rules about public announcements, not smoothing boundaries as if they were inconveniences. I also had the recognition that time's economy does not always allow for the perfect moralisms we devise in bright rooms. My answer required both care and measure. I said yes to the practical help, appointments, meals, overnight presence on a schedule, but I attached conditions that were familiar by now: calls that were more frequent and not performative, commitments to attend therapy with the family's mediator present when conversations threatened to relitigate old slights, and a promise that my sister would, without fail, ask permission before posting anything that involved me or the house. My mother agreed, without theatricality. She had, in these years, been practicing a different kind of speech. The earlier apologies that had once seemed designed for an audience had become quieter and more private. They arrived as practical concessions. I will call on Tuesday, I will not post without asking, I will tell her not to crop the photos. These were modest things, but they were the same things I had demanded years earlier. They were evidentiary, they could be checked. Over the winter I drove down to her house more frequently than I might have predicted. I sat with her in the hospital hallway once, dozing through the noise, and I cooked for her in a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and the faint chlorine of disinfectant. Where there had once been an outsized need for performance, there was now a steady metronome of attendance. There were hiccups. In January 2023, after a long day at the clinic, my sister, in a moment of old reflex, uploaded a collage of my mother's recovery photos to the family blog with captions that included intimate details I had not consented to share. The post appeared with enough speed that it felt like an ambush. I was furious. The old ledger flared. But the protocols did their work. She called within an hour, embarrassed and chastened, to say she had made a mistake and to ask how to make it right. She removed the post and emailed a copy privately to family members who asked for it, and then she sat with me on a late afternoon and listened to the ways that sharing had been a kind of theft. Her apology was not theatrical. It was followed by a small reparation. She scheduled a call the next day just to talk with me, and in the week that followed she asked me before publishing subsequent updates. The pattern held. The dynamic shifted in another direction as well. My mother, who had once used social gestures as a way to smooth, now used the protocols as scaffolding to ask for more than practical care. In March 2023, after a difficult night, she sent a message. I have been thinking about what it would mean to be forgiven. Not a big speech, but to be forgiven so that I can die without this weight. The sentence was blunt. It contained, at once, the mortal arithmetic of aging and the older question of whether years of small offenses could be balanced by a late request. I recognized the instrument of the ledger, not a tally kept to hurt, but a map used to determine whether the work of repair had been sustained. I did not grant absolution as a single event. I never had. But I did, with the protocols as my terms, give practical presence. Over the spring and into the summer of 2023 I spent extended stretches at her house, sometimes sleeping there, sometimes driving her to her appointments, sometimes merely being present while she read the paper or played a familiar song on the radio. When difficult memories rose, old slights, the graduation that had once been ignored, I named them plainly and insisted they not be turned into bargaining chips. My mother listened in ways she had rarely listened before, without explanation, without the habitual reflex to smooth. She began, slowly, to recount parts of the past differently. She admitted, in offhand remarks, that she had prioritized a moment when she should have prioritized another person. She did not ask for immediate forgiveness so much as for the chance to show she had changed. The sister, too, continued to change in ways that were both dramatic and modest. She brought casseroles without comments, she called before posting. When an argument flared between my mother and me over something small, a bill, a missed appointment, she sometimes mediated, asking clarifying questions and refusing to let either of us monologue. These were not grand conversions, they were chores done in the name of decency. By late 2023, the family's public presence diminished. The blog, once thick with images and commentary, had become quieter, reserved for matters that were negotiated rather than assumed. Money, however, complicated the ethics of care in ways that protocols could not fully contain. My mother's medical bills mounted through 2023 and into 2024. Insurance covered some things, but not all. My sister's financial life had its own pressures. The question of who paid for what introduced a new ledger. It required not only emotional accounting but fiscal honesty. We negotiated payment schedules, who would pay for in-home care, how to split costs for a necessary home modification. The terms we set were procedural, a spreadsheet, regular meetings, and an agreement to consult a neutral financial advisor if tensions high. The old theater of apology was nowhere in the discussion. It was replaced by the prosaic language of invoices and checks. In the winter of 2024, my mother's condition worsened. The nights were longer, the hospital visits more frequent. There were conversations in small rooms with fluorescent lights about palliative options and hospice enrollment. The ledger, my ledger, continued to insist on evidence. Had the family adapted its habits to protect my place at the table? Had the sister continued to ask permission? Had my mother kept her phones and calls and small, repetitive promises? The answer, on balance, was yes. Not perfectly. Not immutably. But yes. And then, one pale March morning, my mother did something I had not expected. She sat up in her chair and, with a voice that shook, she said, "I am asking you to forgive me." It was not an offer of absolution to be granted for the camera. It did not come with the theatrical brass of a public mea culpa. It came as a direct address, as if she had been trying on the sentence for years and had finally found the moment to wear it without ornament. The request was not a demand to be erased of consequence. It was a small asking that matched the tone of the years we had spent rebuilding. My response was deliberate. "I have been forgiving you for a long time," I said. "Not as a single gift, but in ledgers and in practice. I have chosen to make room in my life for you when it matters. I have asked for boundaries that let me live. That is my forgiveness." The words were not meant to be a rebuke. They were meant to place the act of forgiving into the terms that had governed our life since 2014. Concrete behaviors, repeated acts, and a refusal to allow rhetoric to stand in for change. Our conversations in those months were honest and often small. We spoke about the graduation that had been missed and why it had happened, and for the first time my mother told me about the fear that had prompted her choice that day, a fear of a rupture she did not know how to repair, a belief that smoothing would preserve peace. She spoke of my father and of the ways grief had changed her capacity to take certain social risks. She did not excuse herself, she offered context. I accepted that context as one piece of the map but not the whole. Forgiveness, after all, was still mine to name. As care deepened, so did the ethics of attention. I insisted on practical things. No photos without permission, scheduled calls to maintain clarity, and joint meetings with clinicians when decisions about advanced directives had to be made. My sister and I signed legal papers, power of attorney and a health proxy that reflected the boundaries we had built. The documents were not a sign that the ledger had been closed. They were a way to make sure decisions would follow the patterns of decency we had worked to establish. They were another instrument to prevent the relapse into old patterns where a single day could eclipse a decade. There were moments of tenderness that, oddly, felt more precious because of the ledger rather than in spite of it. In April 2024, my mother and I sat on the porch as the tree in the yard unfurled fresh leaves. She asked about my life in the way people ask when they want both news and absolution. She told me stories about my father that I had never heard. Small details of his absent-mindedness, the way he buttered his toast, the name of the dog he had when he was 19. These were not dramatic confessions. They were small gifts of narrative that stitched us together. They were also evidence that she wanted me to be in the story on my own terms. Yet the ledger remained. I had not emptied it. Memory, for me, remained a map to consult. I matched moments of compassion with continued expectations, continued calls, not smoothing, and the insistence that apologies be accompanied by ordinary change. There was, always, the possibility of relapse. Old reflexes lived like dormant seeds. But the house had been rewired by habit and by a set of documents, appointments, and circuits that made relapse more visible and therefore easier to name. By the summer of 2024, my mother's appetite for social performance had noticeably diminished. She posted less, she preferred small gatherings, and she allowed certain slippages in social theater to pass without fixing them into a spectacle. She requested, on a late August afternoon, that I read aloud some of the letters she had kept from my father. We sat together in the living room where the morning light pooled, and she handed me the stack with hands that trembled. The letters were not dramatic revelations. They were ordinary sentences written in an ordinary human way. Reading them felt like an archaeology of affection, a slow peeling back of things that had always been there but were obscured by the noise of other matters. Our family's life in 2024 was thus a series of small practices. Calendars with exact times, therapy sessions scheduled at intervals that made old patterns less likely, and an acceptance that care sometimes required sustained proximity. The ledger had not been abolished. It remained a tool for prudence rather than a weapon for punishment. When my mother's health took another small downturn in late September, we convened, as we had agreed, and created a plan that included hospice if necessary. We shared the information with the family after receiving consent from my mother, who now preferred fewer proclamations and more quiet decisions. The sister made a point of calling me each morning, a steady habit that had been impossible to imagine in the years before June 14, 2014. What surprised me, in the long arc from that parking lot day to the present, was not only that decency could be engineered through lists and therapy and legal forms, but that it could feel less like a punishment to require it. Demanding evidence did not strip others of humanity, it preserved mine. Requiring acknowledgement and small, repeated acts of change made it possible for me to offer care without collapsing into old patterns of being defined exclusively by injury. The ledger, therefore, became the frame by which I could love without dissolving. There remains, in the months now stretching forward, no neat ending. My mother's life is finite in ways that are visible and increasingly proximate. I have said yes to care, and I have kept my terms. I have accepted small mercies and insisted on ordinary changes. My sister continues to learn, not by a sudden conversion but by the slow discipline of calling, asking, and occasionally faltering. Our house, like the tree outside, is vulnerable and growing. The protocols we made have become a second language. They do not erase the memory of that day when my graduation was sidelined. They do, however, make space for a different story to be told, one where a person can be both the wounded and the one who chooses to live without perpetual antagonism. The future will require more tending, more small proofs of care, and more days where apology is matched by change, but the ledger, used wisely, allows for that work to proceed without annihilating either truth or tenderness. The hospice team arrived in stages, like a slow, sensible siege. In October 2024, we moved from emergency room conversations to a formal hospice intake, and by November the home was threaded with the new vocabulary of comfort care: morphine when pain spiked, repositioning every few hours, a nurse who would speak quietly and assess swallowing. We kept the house dim at night and bright in the mornings. We mapped sleep shifts on a shared calendar and posted it on the refrigerator next to the schedule of payments we had begun in earnest in the spring. The paperwork I had once resented became practical scaffolding: clinical notes, medication lists, hospice directives that translated the earlier legal decisions into bedside procedures. The power of attorney and the health proxy, signed in 2024, meant that choices were no longer speculative arguments but clinical orders to be carried out or deferred with clear documentation. On November 12, 2024, the sister took the morning shift and I stayed through the afternoon. She brought a bowl of soup and sat with her hands folded, not making empty jokes. That week she cancelled a business meeting she could not afford to miss a year earlier. By then she could afford to choose other priorities. The ledger had changed her calculus in small, arithmetic ways. At one point, after a long silence, she said, "I was selfish about the party." She did not ask me to nod or to absolve her with a gesture. She added, "I know it didn't look like I was choosing you, but I see now what I didn't let myself see." Her voice was literal and contained, the kind of sentence that rests on facts rather than theatrics. I repeated for her what I had told my mother in March: forgiveness as continuity. I said, "Then show it again and again. Let it be visible." By December, the bills that had seemed administrative had thickened into bank statements I could not ignore. Insurance paid for some hospice services, but home modifications and round-the-clock aids required a new calculation. We used the financial advisor we had agreed to consult in 2023. In a meeting on December 18, 2024, the three of us, my sister, the advisor, and I, laid out the remaining assets, the necessary expenses projected into 2025, and the options: assisted living if home care became untenable, or additional private aids if hospice proved insufficient for overnight needs. The advisor did not moralize, he did arithmetic. He provided scenarios and conservative contingencies, which felt oddly consoling. The human drama had to be translated into predictable numbers so that decisions would not be made in the heat of grief. The turning point came more in tone than in a single act. On January 9, 2025, my mother experienced a change in cognition consistent with the progression we had been told to expect. She confused past and present in quiet, almost tender ways. She called my father by the wrong name and apologized a half-second later. The small acts of narrative, the letters we had read in August, the stories of 16-year-old dogs and buttered toast, began to surface in her speech like fossils unearthed by slow erosion. She asked to hear the names of her children in order. She said, "Tell me again about the graduation," and for the first time since March 2014 the old theater returned in a liminal private form. She did not demand an audience, she sought understanding. I told her what I had already put in my ledger. That day had mattered, that anger had been legitimate, but that the story had not stopped there. I said aloud what I had arranged through papers and calendars, that I had been involved in her care since 2023, that she had asked for forgiveness in March 2024, and that we had acted on it together. She nodded, as if confirming a plot line. When she said, "It hurt," I said, "I know," and the answer felt proportionate. Hospice made room for small rituals. We created a quiet schedule for visitors that preserved the privacy I had insisted on and the sister honored. We asked family friends to postpone social media tributes, and when distant relatives arrived we asked them to sit and talk rather than take pictures. The blog, which had been loud in earlier years, remained nearly silent. The sister, who used to photograph and caption, now texted short updates to a small group rather than post broadly. This restraint mattered. When the inevitable memorial language began to press against the front door of our lives, we chose grammar that reflected the ledger, facts and small tender acts rather than theatrical repentance for an audience. On February 2, 2025, my mother asked for my hand. She was thinner, her voice a soft rasp. She held my fingers with surprising strength and murmured, "Thank you for being here." That sentence contained a world. It was not a total absolution, nor a request to forget. It was, rather, an acknowledgement that we were all doing the best we could in the narrow area of time that remained. I told her again that I had made room in my life for her when it counted. We spoke about the graduation in the way adults speak about history, factual, acknowledging, without theatrical reconstruction. She wanted to know if I felt resentful still. I said that resentment lived in a drawer I opened occasionally to look at the map of what had happened, but that I had removed its power to dictate my days. That, I said, was the work of the last decade. Her decline continued through February and into March. On March 18 she became less coherent, and the hospice nurse suggested we prepare for the end. There were practical things to do: arrange the final accounts, contact the clergy she had once trusted to come if she wanted, and emotional things to do that required preparation. We read the letters again, not in search of dramatic confessions but to rehearse the ordinary love they contained. My sister sat with a printed photograph on which our mother wore a ridiculous hat from a family party in 2009. She cried without violence. The grief was steady, like a tide drawing back and close. When my mother died on March 25, 2025, the house felt at once empty and filled with the routine we had established. She left with her hospital bracelet still on, a small relic of the months when professional workers had threaded through our home. The moment of death was intimate, and there was no need for a show. We called the funeral home we had vetted months before. Another practical step that felt less like preparation for spectacle and more like a responsible closure. That night, my sister and I sat up and spoke about the ledger. She said, "You were right." She did not mean it as capitulation but as admission. The ledger, she said, had taught her to act differently. She asked, softly, whether I would be angry if she married her partner in the house in a year's time. I considered the question and answered honestly. I wanted to be part of the family's continuing life, but I also wanted that life to respect the boundaries we had set. She promised to ask permission rather than assume. The funeral, held on March 29, adhered to many of the constraints we had set. It was small and private, limited to those who had been present in caregiving and a few distant family members we had agreed could attend. Photographs were restricted. There would be no live stream, no viral archive. The clergy spoke of ordinary faith and ordinary failures, referencing the letters my father had written and the small, human details of a life that had never been simple. In the receiving line afterward, a cousin said, awkwardly, "I'm sorry about the graduation thing," decades after the fact. The remark could have reopened wounds, but the ledger had reshaped the parameters of conversation. I nodded, thanked him, and then redirected the talk toward an anecdote from my mother's youth that the cousin had mentioned. It was a deliberate tactic, to keep the story in proportion and to prevent old slights from becoming the crest of every wave. In the months that followed, the material realities of death required attention. We executed the will, paid the final bills, and closed accounts as required. There was a surplus we had not expected. Small savings my mother had tucked away in a low-interest account. We used part of it, agreed by the advisor and by my sister, to cover a memorial in the spring of 2026 that would be private and modest. The rest was split according to the will and to the practical needs each of us had. Money, which had complicated ethical decisions for years, now operated with a less charged language, invoices and receipts and the quiet arithmetic of finality. Grief did not end with the funeral. In April and May 2025 my sister drove over on weekends, often to water the garden my mother had tended. She sometimes left notes, short pen and paper notes, that said things like, "I'm trying," or "Thank you for setting the rules." The domestic rituals that had seemed bureaucratic before now felt like scaffolding that allowed us to hold sorrow without being consumed by it. Therapy sessions continued for both of us. The therapist we had shared on occasion in 2024 suggested that rituals of accountability could serve as a bridge between justice and mercy. That phrasing, clinical as it was, seemed to match what we were living. Spring 2026 approached and with it the plan for the small memorial. We chose May 16, 2026, a date that had no significance in the old theater of family performance but that fit calendars and the blooming schedule of the yard. Invitations were given to a closed list, and we agreed that no public statements would be made. The sister asked if it would be possible to have a small slideshow of photographs. I declined, not in meanness but to preserve the ethos we had cultivated, private memory rather than public performance. She accepted. It was, in many ways, the last major compromise we negotiated under the terms our ledger required. What surprised me through the long arc, from June 14, 2014 to the quiet of 2026, was how much endurance domestic moralities required. It was easy to imagine forgiveness as a single, theatrical act. It was harder, and ultimately truer, to experience it as a series of sustained practices. The ledger, legal documents, calendars, financial plans, and the unglamorous discipline of scheduled phone calls, had not been a way to claw at righteousness. It had been a method of preservation, of my own capacity to care without losing the contours of my life. In the course of these years I learned that to insist on evidence is not to demand ceremonial penance, but to ask for patterns of behavior that protect both the one who was hurt and the person seeking to be better. There were still moments when the old grief returned as if the calendar had changed nothing. On the anniversary of my graduation, June 14, I found myself walking past the parking lot and feeling the shape of that betrayal again. But the feeling, when it came, no longer arranged my life. I consulted the map I had kept, letters read, calls scheduled, legal forms signed, and let the evidence inform my reflection rather than dominate it. I had forgiven in practice long before I had named it in March 2024, and in the end the act of forgiving was less a single decision than a series of ordinary choices. To show up, to insist on boundaries, to call when promised, and to refuse the theater of performative remorse. The sister's life continued to reorient. By late 2026 she had begun volunteering at a hospice, an uncomfortable but sincere attempt to translate her changed priorities into public acts of service. She said she wanted to give back, not to erase the past but to cultivate practices that made such failures less likely in the future. When she told me this in September 2026, over coffee in our mother's kitchen, I felt the ledger extend from a document of protection into a framework for generativity. It was not that pain disappeared, rather, the pain was reframed as a cautionary tale, a reason to do better. I did not imagine that the ledger would be the kind of story people told at parties, and indeed we never returned to the spectacle that had once been our way of being. Instead, our family settled into a quieter reputation, the kind of people who kept their promises because they had learned the cost of never doing so. Forgiveness, by the time the leaves turned in 2026, felt less like an answer than like a temperament we cultivated, one grounded in repeated, ordinary acts. There remain questions that will not find neat endings. There will be moments when the ledger will feel like a cold instrument and times when memory will insist on its full weight. But I have watched, over these 12 years, how small repeated acts can remap a family. I have seen apology become practice, anger become set rules, and grief be held without letting it define every ensuing year. I have learned that one can demand evidence of change and still offer care without annihilating tenderness, and that the work of choosing to live otherwise is continuous and not triumphant, and that the last request my mother made with clear eyes, simply to be heard and to be forgiven in the terms of our life, was one that required years of patient, sometimes tedious work. To honor fully. After the leaves turned in 2026, the calendar continued to act both as a map and as a restraint. I kept the drawer where the resentment had lived, now more a filing cabinet than a locked chest. The rules we had built, what to expect, what to demand, how to accept apologies, remained in force. Yet life does not stop at any ledger, and from late 2026 an unexpected set of entries began to accumulate in the margins. On February 3, 2027, my sister called to say our father had fallen at home. He was unhurt in the physical sense but shaken, and the fall forced a cascade of small reckonings. The house where he lived, our parents' house, the same one that had held the hat from 2009 and the hospital bracelet from the end, required modifications, railings, a repair to the backstep that had claimed him, and someone to help with grocery runs. For the first months after our mother's death we had let the house breathe, now it needed tending. We split tasks according to the ledger's terms, scheduled visits, paid for services, and clear notes about expectations. Even so, the practical work reopened old corridors. At the end of March 2027, during a visit I had scheduled, my father brought up the graduation. He had not been one to speak in long paragraphs about past hurts. He had been better at the small, practical apologies recorded in the letters. That evening he said, in a voice that sounded older than his years, "I know we chose poorly." He did not ask for a theatrical absolution. He asked instead, whether forgiveness meant I would never hold it against them again. I answered with the language of the ledger. Forgiveness required evidence, steady behavior, not a single utterance. He nodded, and the conversation moved toward practicalities. Who would change the light bulbs, where to place the railings? It was in that frame that his next request arrived. On October 12, 2028, after another fall, he called from the house and asked whether he could come stay with me for a while. The phrase "come stay" felt, in context, like a compressed summation of decades of choices and failures. He did not phrase it as begging for forgiveness in full. He begged rather for space. Space to be looked after, for the simple daily ministrations of coffee in the morning and conversation in the evening. He had been, for 48 hours before the call, adrift between the idea of dignity and the reality of needing help. The ledger required me to treat this as a present fact. What do we need to do now, and what rules will govern it? I remember the date because I wrote it down in the same notebook where I had tracked the pledge to attend graduations and the correspondence about the memorial. On October 14, 2028, we drew up an agreement that felt both bureaucratic and humane: scheduled visiting hours, a stipend to contribute to the household expenses, an exit plan should the arrangement prove untenable. My sister and I agreed on the terms after consulting the caregiver agency we had used for our mother, and we decided, as the ledger demanded, to formalize what we could. There was no rhetoric about lifelong debt, there was only a clear articulation of expectations, alongside a willingness to see him as a vulnerable person rather than a figure of authority. The months that followed were not tidy. Our father's presence in my small apartment made apparent the generational differences in domestic grammar. He forgot to close drawers. He read the morning paper at an hour when I needed quiet. He called my sister 3 times in one day with the same question about the thermostat. There were moments when old resentments surfaced like stones after rains. Yet there were also ordinary, small reframes. He learned my coffee preference. I learned how to call his primary care doctor without shame. It was not reconciliation as a spectacle, but reconciliation as a set of ordinary practices. Precisely the lesson the ledger had insisted upon. There were tests of the arrangement. In April 2029, during a heated exchange with my sister about whether our father should move into assisted living permanently, he asked, almost plaintively, "Do you think I deserve any kindness?" The question dropped into the room like a coin into a well. My answer was not immediate. I thought of the graduation day, of the party my parents had chosen for my sister, of the legal forms and letters that had charted our course. I thought of the long accumulation of small acts that had become the measure of apology: calls returned, actions taken, notations kept. I said, yes. Deserving is not the only test. We can choose kindness, even when it is inconvenient. That is how we change patterns. He listened in a way that suggested a person learning an unfamiliar grammar. Not every neighborly gesture repaired history.